So, last time I said we would spend a while looking at the first few pages of the frege. Actually, I think today I will wrap up on the frege and start in on the cell article proper nouns. Can I just ask, how many of you have read the frege at this point? How many of you feel you've got a pretty good grasp on what's going on there? How many of you found it difficult? Wow, okay. This is pretty good. Only half of you found it difficult. And as well over half, I think you've got a pretty good grasp of what's going on. Very good. Okay, so just to orient, in this first section we'll just be looking at different ways of thinking about sense and reference. Then in the second unit of the class, there's tons of places right down there. In the second unit we'll be looking at the causal theories of reference that people generally believe today. And we'll go on to look at these questions about how there can be such a thing as meaning in the world that science describes, and what the relation is between having a language, having meaning, and being embedded in a society. Okay. But today I want to start out by just reviewing questions about sense, then look at a distinction that's really basic to cells theory between nouns and descriptions, and then go on to just give a first quick sketch of cells theory, and we'll go on and look more at cell on Wednesday, today being Monday. Okay, so Cell's paper is, again, quite short. It's easier to read than the frege. And if you get what's going on in this class, you should not have much trouble seeing what Cell is saying in that paper. It's a very good, firm, clear paper. Okay, so we had a contrast between general terms and singular terms. You get singular terms like Sally, that stand for objects. You get general terms like is, Paul, that ascribe a property to a thing. These are quite different. Everybody happy with this? You get your Sally part, you get your is, Paul part. Suppose I say Isaac smokes. Which is the general term and which is the singular term? Is Isaac the general term or the singular term? Very good. What about smokes? General. Very good. Raleigh fishes? Is fishes general or singular? General. Is Raleigh general or singular? Singular. Very good. Okay. Okay. So right now we are focusing on the singular terms and the question. The singular term is always tied up to an object. That's what a singular term is. One that's referring to a thing before you go on to ascribe some property to it. Another question is, how does that happen? How does the singular term get connected up to an object? And Frege's theory is applying to singular terms of all kinds. And actually, there are lots of different kinds of singular terms when you think about it. And we had Sally, Isaac, and Raleigh there as singular terms. Now these are all proper names. Okay, so Sally is a proper name, Isaac is a proper name, Raleigh is a proper name, California, the moon, the morning star. These are all names. But there are also terms like, if I say, what is this anyway? I keep waving this about, but I always wonder what it is. But what is this? There's that use of this there. It is a singular term. It's singling out a particular object, but it's not a name. You can call anything you like, this or that. Yeah? Or as John McCain referred to Barack Obama as that one. That is using a demonstrative in place of a name. Right? A term like that. Yeah? So there are terms like these, demonstratives, this and that are also referring to particular objects. These are not general terms. And there's definite descriptions. I say, the student who came up at the end of last class to ask about arbitrariness, or the tall man who called earlier, or Frege's example, the point of intersection of A and B. or a king of the West Saxons. Right? These all look like they are just singling out an object that you're then going to go on and talk about. Right? So if I say the tallest person in the room, is that general or singular? Singular. Singular. Yeah, I mean it's hooking out an object for you to go on and talk about. Yeah. There is something a little bit strange about these definite descriptions, though, because if you look very closely, they have general terms in them, like tall, man, calls, intersection, point. And these are general terms. X is tall, X is a point, X is a king. These are all general terms, right? These ascribe properties to things. So these these we should be suspicious of, right? Because they look like singular terms, but they have general terms in them. So there's an issue. What's going on here? Is this singular or general? And this matters because, well, for many reasons, but one basic reason is that the whole question we're addressing is defined as how does a singular term get tied up to an object? So Frege tends to talk about proper names, like Sally, California, the moon, the morning star. But a lot of his examples are definite descriptions too. So Frege's theory is it's sense that fixes reference. Sense is hooking up the name to the object. And the way he gets at the notion of sense is with this distinction between uninformative and informative identities. So when you've got an uninformative identity, A is identical to A, the morning star is the morning star, the man who called this morning is the man who called this morning. So you've got an uninformative identity like that. You get the same sense here and here. If you get the same sense here and here, he says, it's got to be uninformative. If you get different senses, then it's informative. That's how you explain that distinction between the informative and the uninformative identities. And then the move is sense. We introduced sense as a kind of theoretical notion. It's kind of a posit. You say, whatever it is that explains informativeness, we're going to call that sense. It's like a theoretical notion. Like, as you might say, whatever is causing the atom to behave like this, we'll call that an electron. So this is just postulated. He hasn't told you anything about what sense is. He's told you about something about what it does. It's a very kind of abstract notion. It's just a postulate. There must be such a thing as sense. And then sameness of sense will explain uninformativeness. Difference of sense will explain informativeness. And he doesn't just give you that it's a purely unexplained postulate. He gives you these metaphors and pictures, like I was talking last time about your take on the object or your perspective on the object, the way you get onto the object. And then the move is, sense is what explains informativeness, but sense is also what is hooking up the sign to the object. And that's not trivial. I mean, on the face of it, it could be that you need one notion to explain these phenomena about informativeness, and a quite different idea to explain how the sign gets hooked up to the object. But Frege's move is to say, no, it's the same thing. Sense explains informativeness, and sense is also what hooks the sign up to the object. And he's saying it's got to be the same thing. Okay, so if you found the Frege fairly straightforward, you should be finding this fairly straightforward. Is this fairly straightforward? Okay, sometimes I'm not very sure whether people are puzzled because I'm going on for so long about it, or if they're puzzled because it doesn't make any sense. But you see the connect here that he's making here. There are two quite different ideas, informativeness and the fixing of reference, and he's connecting them. Okay? You all comfortable with that? Okay, but then the next question is, so what is sense? It's going to be very important if this is the work it does, but what is it anyhow? Well, I said we've got these three classes, the singular terms, we've got the names, we've got the demonstratives, and we got the descriptions. And if you ask, well, what does Frege think a sense is? And what do you guys think a sense is? What is the view? Yes?
It's like uses the phrase like the mode of designation.
The mode of designation, right. I agree, and that's important. But what is that?
Not just what it hooks up to, but how it's hooking up to it.
How it's hooking up to it, yeah. Well, can you say a little bit more? What is it? How it's hooking up? Is it with a rope? Do you see what I mean? Is it? What are the mechanics of it?
So if you have two words with different senses that refer to the same object, the sense is how you view that object.
That is completely accurate so far as it goes, but it's not yet telling us what the mechanics are, or how the sign is getting hooked up to the thing. Okay, so there's something a string of us or so. So 1, 2, 3, and then come to the front there. So you.
So I mean, I might be completely off track here, but I'm thinking of it in terms of like mathematically. Like you can say the number, 7, or you can say the number that's between 6 and 8. You're describing the same thing, but you're describing a different property about the same object. So that's how I look at the sense.
That's very good. Okay, so but you talked about a property there. Yeah, we're talking about how the singular term gets hooked up to the object. What's a property got to do with it? Right, property was the full part.
Yeah, but I mean, you identify the object with properties, whether it's a visual object or else.
You identify the object by its properties, is that what you think?
Yeah.
Okay, that's excellent. That is very close, I think, to what Frege is thinking. Yeah.
These ideas that we have that comes with the sense that corresponds.
The idea we have that comes with the sense.
Yeah, that corresponds to the object or the reference.
When Frege talks about an idea, he actually means to be saying, I think, you guys have just been reading this, so you check me if this is right, but I think he means to say that ideas are actually irrelevant to the process by which the sign gets hooked up to the object. Because, I talk about Tom, you and I are talking about, let's say, the Vice Chancellor. I have free songs of terror when we hear about the Vice Chancellor. You think this is a genial, friendly figure, right? So the ideas in that sense are different, but the way the mechanics of the language are working to let us both talk about that same person, that might be just the same for both you and me, whereas the subjective ideas we associate with the term might be quite different. Yeah. In a moment, yeah.
My idea of sense is that...
Can you do that louder?
My idea of sense would probably be that it's how you get onto the fact that the reference object even exists in the first place. It's kind of like a pointer. It's the mode through which you would experience the thing that they're trying to pick out.
Right. That's very good. That's very vivid. I mean, if you think of this as a pointer, right, then that'd be one way a reference could work. I say, who am I calling to question? I say, yes, you, and I do the like. That could work. You could single out a person like that, yeah, or literally with a pointer, you could just touch somebody. But that's a metaphor. Yeah, how are we to describe the strict and literal mechanics of the way the language is working? I want to come back to you. There were a couple of questions up for tonight. Have they got rid of it?
I was just going to add to that. So, like from the book, they were giving the example of the moon as a sign.
Yes.
So then your reference would be the moon itself.
Yep.
So to get from the sign to the reference object, you would say, you look at it through, like, say, a telescope. The image projected into your retina would be the sense, and that explains how, like, different people can have different senses for the same reference because people see things differently because their eyes are shaped differently.
My memory is that's not quite how the analogy works. Right? The thing in your retina is like the idea. Yeah, it's a subjective thing that varies from person to person. It's the image in the mirror in the telescope. Partly telescopes have mirrors, but yes, the image in the mirror that is the same for everyone. Because if you go back to that example of us all talking about the Vice Chancellor, yeah, then the mechanics of the way the language are working are the same for all of us, even if our subjective resonances are different. But the sense is going to be the same for all of us, so we know we're all talking about the same thing. Otherwise, we would really be in this uncertainty, are we talking about the same thing? If what you've got to fix the reference is quite different to what I've got to fix the reference. Do you agree? Okay, yeah, look.
So can we distinguish the sense with the telescope and the moon example? In the first one, you'd be saying something like the moon as seen through a telescope, and another example would be if I could fly up to the moon, then I could say the moon as seen when I'm flying around it. And that would describe two different senses there.
Yes, it would.
So
Yeah.
it's like two different methods or different perspectives on the same reference.
That's right. Yeah, what you, everything you say there I think is correct. The only thing is that what you've done is you've kind of you've shown ways of alluding to two different senses. Yeah. You haven't yet made fully explicit what the sense is. You said it's going to be different in those two cases, and I agree it is going to be different. But what exactly is it that is different? Yeah, that's the remaining question. Last one, and then we should move on. Yeah.
The way I was thinking of it was kind of, we're using this name to designate an object, but there are certain, like there's a set of characteristics belonging to that object, according to which we recognize it as holding that name.
Very good.
And
Yeah.
that's the sense.
I think that's very close to Frege's picture. Yeah. Maybe that even is Frege's picture. Yeah, and that makes it fully explicit. It connects to that earlier suggestion about properties, right? Because what you're calling a characteristic is what I'm calling the property that a general term ascribes. The characteristic will be something like being tall, smoking, fishing, something like that. If you wanted to come back for ages, okay, look. Really
I
honest.
was going to say about the whole idea thing. I was thinking back when you showed the picture of the shed, I guess.
Yeah.
So
right. Yeah.
From one point of view and then from another point of view, those are different senses. But the idea is like whether or not you believe that it's the same shed, right? So that would be the distinction between idea and sense.
You could think of the idea like that. I think that's not how Frege thinks of it. Frege thinks of it much more like a kind of palpitation or a sensation you get when you talk about the thing. Yeah. He's not really thinking of the idea as a belief you have. Yeah. Okay, but that needs more discussion. Okay. Well, I think in practice what happens when Frege gets down to brass tacks and he really has to tell you what the sense of a name is, what always happens is that he gives you a definite description. So if he's giving you the sense of a name, like Sally or California or the moon, he always gives you, he explains to you what the sense is by giving you a description. Now that's a little bit weird because these are both singular terms, right? And we're trying to explain how singular terms work. So what he does is he explains how this kind of singular term works by talking about this kind of singular term. So he says the sense of Aristotle is the teacher of Alexander the Great, who was born in Stagira. You say Stagira and I say anyway. Okay, or he gives this example. You got a triangle. Okay, if you guys are so awkward Frege, this should be a piece of cake. But you got a triangle here. This is side. This is line A. This is line C, and this is line B, connecting each vertex to the midpoint of the opposing side. Okay, lines A, B, and C. And Frege says, look, the point of intersection of line A and line B is the same as the point of intersection of line B and line C. Is that an informative identity? Yeah, and he gives that as his example, as clear example of how there can be two different modes of presentation of the same thing. So his explanation of how it can happen, that there are two different modes of presentation of the same thing, is to give you two different descriptions. Right, so this is a description, and this is a description. Now, the theory then is, our problem was, how does the name get hooked up to the object? How does language connect to the world in the first place? And Frege does the thing with informativeness and says, so we need a notion of sense, and it's the sense that is actually hooking up the name to the object. And then we say, well, what is the sense? Well, the sense is a description. The name is getting hooked up to the object by being associated with a description. So if you want to know how a name like Aristotle is getting hooked up to the object, it's getting hooked up to the object by being connected with a description. So if you want to understand how Aristotle gets hooked up to the person, it's by being hooked up to that description, the teacher of Alexander the Great, who was born in Stagaia. So he's explaining how names refer, and that is really not, I mean, that's quite plausible. You see why someone would say that, right? You don't know who Aristotle is. You never heard of it. Yep.
Can you say that a description is taken as presentation?
As presentation. I think that's what Frege is saying. Yeah, the description is the way the thing is being presented. Yep. So if the description, if you don't know who the Vice Chancellor is, and I say, well, it's our wise and noble leader, being terrified, and then I've just given you a description to explain the meaning of the name. Right? And that, yeah, I think Frege is saying that is the mode of presentation. So that is quite plausible. You hear some name you never heard before, and you say, who's that? What happens is you get a description. But then that just raises the question, how do the descriptions refer? The descriptions are just more language. We wanted to be at the most basic level of language use and be addressing the most primitive question about how the whole thing gets going in the first place. And now we're being told, well, our problem was, how does the name get hooked up to the thing? And now we're being told the name gets hooked up to the thing by being associated with another bit of language, namely the definite description. So now we've got to ask, how do definite descriptions refer? And is it right the descriptions are more basic than names? I mean, could you have a language that had names in it but no descriptions? Could you have a language in it that had descriptions but no names? I suppose anthropologists come back from their latest field trip to, I don't know, somewhere in Asia Minor, and they say, you know, we found an isolated village where the people have a language that has names but don't have any descriptions. They can't form descriptions. Then Frege's theory would be wrong, right? Because they're getting the names to hook up to the objects without having any descriptions in their language. So it's not obvious, this. Or could you really have a language with descriptions and no names? Could the anthropologists come back and say, well, look at this lot. They don't have the idea of giving names to people or names to things, but they have descriptions, all right. You talk about the king of the West Saxons, well, maybe not the king of the West Saxons, the king of the people in the village over there. But it never occurred to them to call them Saxons or to call this guy Alfred. Did that happen? Well, there's a more kind of mundane question you can raise. Suppose you take a name like Aristotle, or a name that people use more often, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Barack Obama, Dick Cheney. Well, opinions as to the sense might differ, Frege says. Take the name Dick Cheney. I associate with it a description like the hidden hand that saw us safely through these last 10 years. And you associate, I suppose, some quite different description. And so opinions, as Frege says, opinions as to the sense differ. Right? So you get your description associated with it, and I get my description associated with it. Or with Aristotle, you might say it's the pupil of Plato and the teacher of Alexander the Great. But someone else might say, no, the description I associate with Aristotle is the teacher of Alexander the Great who was born in Stagira. So you just take it as definitional of who Aristotle is, that he was born in Stagira. Whereas I know that he was a pupil of Plato and the teacher of Alexander the Great, but I have no idea where he was born. I didn't know that about Stagira. And Frege says, rather sternly, so long as the descriptions all pick out the same object, so long as the reference remains the same, these variations in sense may be tolerated, but, he says sternly, they are to be avoided in the theoretical structure of a demonstrative science and ought not to occur in a perfect language. So it's kind of tolerance, you know. He doesn't mind this going on a bit, but don't let it get out of hand. Okay, you can have some variation in the description you associate with a name. And if you think about real proper names, you know, if you and I are talking, if you're telling me about some other student or some other professor, then we may both know the person, but the descriptions you associate with a sign are likely to be quite different. So this kind of phenomenon that he's talking about here is really going to be very widespread. And he's saying it's regrettable, but okay, so long as the descriptions all pick out the same thing, that's okay. Okay, so that's a quick look at names versus descriptions. And Frege looks like he's saying the mode of presentation is a description. So if you want to cash out that thing about the take or the perspective or the way of being given the thing, you do it by specifying the description. And that really fits with what people were saying earlier about characteristics or properties of the thing. Because if you think about a description, it's always specifying something by specifying its characteristics. That's what the general terms are doing in the description. They're specifying the characteristics of the thing that indicate which one you want to be talking about. Yeah.
When I refer to Aristotle, do I refer to the bones that lie somewhere, or to my idea of Aristotle, or the person I read in some?
I think the idea is you're referring to the person. Now, if you think that those bones are identical to the person, which you may do, yeah, you may think it is a dead person. You see what I mean? But of course, there are views in which the dead person is not a person. The dead person is an ex-person and has ceased to be. Yeah. So if you think the bones are identical to the person, you know, say, yeah, I'm referring to that. But that's the same bones, the same person that wrote the celebrated works of philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't understand how the cyclical definition of sense helps us clarify anything, because you're defining sense through, you know, description, and description is made of more language, as you said, and each one of those, you know, probably has a reference, and the whole problem is cyclical. So how do we avoid that?
That's very good. Yeah. Stern, but forceful. I think that's right. I think that is a real puzzle about Frege's way of going at things. I mean, when you think about informativeness versus uninformativeness, the idea that descriptions are what have to do with informativeness, that's very plausible, right? That you've got a different description on either side of your identity sign, then you're going to get something informative. That's very intuitive. Yeah, is that okay?
But descriptions are made more.
That's right. That's right. So it's one thing to say that you've got an informative identity when you have a different description on either side. That might be right. It's a different thing to say what explains how language hooks up to the world is the fact that the names are getting hooked up to descriptions. Because if we didn't yet explain how the descriptions are getting hooked up to the world, I don't know that it's cyclical exactly. It would be cyclical if, in order to explain how a description hooked up to the world, you had to say, well, the description gets hooked up to the world by being associated with a name. Then you're really in trouble, right? You see that? Yeah.
I had a question question about the perfect language thing. Like, why can there not be variations? And does the name should include all the senses that are possible for that reference?
No. It's that for you and I to have a stable way of talking about people, then really the best would be if we associated the same descriptions with the same names. Yeah? Because if you associate a different description with the name than I do, then there is a real risk that we might be talking about different people. Yeah? Whereas if we associate the same description with the name, we're bound to be talking about the same person. Yeah? So it eliminates that possibility of misunderstanding or miscommunication if we associate the same descriptions with the same names. I think that's what Craig was thinking in that quote. So it's not that you need to put all the possible descriptions to associate them with the name. You just need to take one description and associate it with the name. But you want to make sure that everybody associates the same description with the name. That's what Craig was saying, I think.
So would it be okay if everybody had a completely unique and different name, even if we had different sense about the descriptions about the same person?
If everybody had a unique name, that would be fine. And what happens next?
Oh, well then would it be okay for us to have different descriptions?
Well, it would be okay, but Frege's point in this passage, I mean, you might disagree with what he's saying here, but his idea is, his view is, the way you guarantee that there's a unique name for everybody is by associating the same description with the same name, by everybody associating the same description with the same name. That's the only way you can bring it about that everyone has a unique name. Because if you can associate what descriptions with the name you like, and I associate what descriptions with the name I like, we might wind up giving that name to different people. Yeah? And that would be terrible. Right? Well, I mean, it may not be that bad, but there will be a significant possibility of miscommunication. Yeah, and he's just talking about how to eliminate that. You're going to come to this? Okay. Yeah.
Is the goal of perfect language always to be informative?
No. Frege is a logician, and logicians love uninformative statements. Yeah. In fact, that's what logicians spend their lives doing, is generating, improving uninformative statements. Somebody's got to do it. Even if you have a perfect language, right, you will have a name like the morning star in it, and you will be able to formulate statements like the morning star is the morning star. Yeah. Can't stop you. Yeah. So even in a perfect language, you'll be able to formulate uninformative statements. I think something that's related, though, is that in a perfect language, there should be completely unambiguous communication of information. That's what he's really after here, I think. Yeah.
But I mean, you said that we have to basically get rid of every other description from one reference except for one in order to have communication in a perfect language. So we could never say the table from this angle and the table from this angle. Like, there could never be those two descriptions of the table, right?
You could have those two descriptions of the table, but you should just connect them to different names. So you're going to say...
So we're never talking about the same table. We're always talking about the table from this
angle.
angle.
You talk about... I talk about table A, right? And then I do my thing, I put my head underneath the table, and I say I'll call this table B, and then I can formulate the informative identity. Table A is table B.
That seems like that would create more miscommunication.
It would certainly be complicated. What you're after there is an important point. And that actually leads right into Cell's objection to Frege. Because when you say that with the table, that would be very complicated, right? Because you just think about that very case. If really we want to give it, as might happen as the class goes on, we want to give this table a name, because we all stare at it and talk about it so much, then it would actually be very difficult, because on Craig's approach here, because in this passage, because you put your take on the table from where you're sitting. Someone right at the back has got a tilted view of the table, yeah? Someone lying underneath it has got a quite different view again, and they've all got to give them different names. Whereas really what you want to do, and that's kind of an artificial example, but if you think about a real case, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? Arnold Schwarzenegger has many aspects, right? There are many takes on Arnold Schwarzenegger. The idea that you've got to give a different name to each one, that's really going to be very complicated and difficult. But that's what Frege is saying there. Yeah.
But then if we do have to do that, then we have to give those informative statements saying, this Arnold Schwarzenegger equals this Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah.
Then if people didn't know that, then there would be no communication. There would just be like...
That's right. They would be able to understand each other, but they wouldn't be able to connect the one that each of them was talking about.
Exactly.
Okay, perfect. And Searle's point is that that's the whole point of having names, is that you don't need to have the same description. So let me walk up to this a little bit. This is a quote from Searle. Searle's thinking, suppose you try and figure how, suppose you reflect on how, really as a matter of empirical fact, names work. Suppose you ask, well, what's going on with the name Aristotle? Suppose you ask everybody in the room, everybody in the campus, everybody in the English-speaking world, ask people to state what they think are the essential and established facts about Aristotle. What are the core facts about Aristotle? Well, you get a whole bunch of descriptions of Aristotle. Born in Stagira, last great philosopher of antiquity, wrote in Greek. You guys must know something about Aristotle. Very old, hundreds of years, right? If we assume that there were many people involved, right, we get a whole bunch of uniquely referring descriptions. Or if you took a name like Arnold Schwarzenegger and just went around the room, you could compile quite a big list of descriptions of what people regard as the essential and established facts about this person. So you call that the cluster of descriptions associated with Aristotle, the kind of big family of descriptions that we have, as it were, in our collective head associated with the name Aristotle. The dossier, the group file on Aristotle. Then Searle's idea is take that big cluster of descriptions that is circulating in the community, not the contents of any one individual's head. That whole cluster of descriptions is what fixes the reference of the name. So the name Aristotle is standing not for whoever matches the description in some one person's head. It's really a social thing, this. There's the group set of descriptions, and it's whoever best matches them. There may be indeterminacy as to which descriptions really get into the cluster. You might think that some of it is uninformed gossip or mere speculation. You might think some descriptions should carry more weight than others. Some descriptions are more important than others. And you might think, well, suppose that one person meets 75% of the descriptions. Is that enough for it to be Aristotle? Suppose it's 60%. Where's the boundaries? There might be some indefiniteness there. But usually that won't matter much. Usually there will be, as it were, this big bag of descriptions, and there will be just one object in the world that uniquely fits most of them. So Frege was saying, in a perfect language, each name would have associated with it exactly one description, the same for everyone. And as that last set of questions well brought out, that's going to be a very complicated and cumbersome procedure. And Searle's idea is, no, the whole point of having names is round the other way. I can't put it any better than Searle himself does. Proper names function not as descriptions, but as pegs on which to hang descriptions. The looseness of the criteria for proper names is a necessary condition for isolating the referring function from the describing function of language. So let me put it like this. Suppose there is one person you know, one person who goes around generating, let us say, a lot of gossip about themselves. So there is this one person that you know, lots of other people know. You all know this person in slightly different ways. You all have slightly different descriptions you associate with that person. Take that big bag of descriptions that are shared between you all, that you jointly generate as applying to that person. And then you're going to use the name as the peg on which to hang that big bag of descriptions. So the whole point is that if we're going to talk about Schwarzenegger, we don't have to say, well, are you associating the description, the star of pumping iron, the seminal bodybuilder, the Terminator, the governor? Which one do you have in mind? You don't have to decide. You just get this loose collection of descriptions, and you're going to use the name as a peg for that. And so you don't have to make up your mind which description you're going to use. Just as with the table, if we want to give this a name, we don't want to have to decide which take on the table we're going to use the name to express. We just want there to be that broad collection of takes, and whatever's at the other end of them, that's the one we're talking about. That's the one we're giving a name to. Searle says the uniqueness and immense pragmatic convenience of proper names in our language. I mean, Frege makes it sound as though if you eliminated all the proper names from the language, you wouldn't lose anything. You could do everything just as well, and in fact better, if you only had the descriptions. But Searle's idea is, no, it's great having names. There is a point to having names. And it's precisely that names let us refer publicly to objects without being forced to raise issues and come to agreement on what descriptive characteristics exactly constitute the identity of the object. So Searle's view is a development of Frege's. Searle said the name gets hooked up to the object by being tied up to a description, and really you all want to make sure that it's the same description associated with the same name. Searle says names get tied up to objects by being associated with descriptions, but it's these loose clusters of descriptions that are doing the work. And note though that descriptions are still being taken to be more basic than names. So that issue that was being raised earlier about, isn't this cyclical? Are we getting anywhere here? Are we making any progress at all here? Is still live, because Searle, like Frege, is saying descriptions are more basic than names. Names are just handy because you don't want to have to decide which description you're going to use. But then we don't yet know how the descriptions refer. We haven't yet got anything about how descriptions hook up to the world. Both Searle and Frege seem to take it as pretty obvious how descriptions hook up to the world. But when you try and spell it out, how do descriptions hook up to objects? How's that meant to work? They seem to think it's the plainest thing in the world. Surely you understand that. But that's just an example of the general problem we were beginning with, namely, your language over here, you get the world over here. How do they get connected? What is the hooking up process? To say names get hooked up to the world by being hooked up to descriptions or to clusters of descriptions just pushes the problem one step back. Okay, so we'll talk more about Searle on Wednesday. Okay? Thanks, great questions.